Welcome to the Scientific Worldview, the podcast dedicated to exploring the big questions in science and philosophy. I am Daniel Gambacorta.
I'm Atana Shannon.
Atana, last episode, we left off talking about some biases in our understanding of history.
Yes.
In this episode, let's delve into history. I just want to talk about some major historical trends which are perhaps not widely appreciated.
Okay, let's talk about it.
I'm going to advance the following thesis. History was bad.
Yes, that's valid.
The past was bad, and it was bad everywhere. And things have gotten better. That is my thesis.
I think it's probably supported.
Well, that's good. You're going to be easy to convince because you already agree.
I was just thinking back to our past episodes.
Sure. Yeah, I've touched upon this previously. But this is in contrast to the narrative you hear, perhaps more often, which is that things were good and then they became bad due to some evil force.
I feel like I haven't heard that before.
You've heard it.
Have I?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
It'll make sense when we dive into it, but there's different versions of this standard narrative. There is the racist version where the evil force is a race of people. So the world was in harmony, and then this race of people, due to the evil in their hearts, did evil things and made the world bad. Another version is the world was in harmony, and then an evil country was founded, and this evil country is the reason for the suffering we see in the world. And I'm going to argue against these standard narratives.
Okay, let's hear it.
For there is no simple story you can tell where the world's ills can be blamed on some race of people nor some particular country.
I don't know, prove it.
Okay. Let's dive into it, starting with our hunter-gatherer ancestors. People imagine that our pre-industrial ancestors were peaceful, egalitarian. They were in tune with nature. They danced around the fire. They didn't have to deal with our modern sorts of problems like violence and war and hate and prejudice. Know what I'm saying?
And Tinder.
And Tinder, the most modern and problematic of problems. But this view is wrong. It's wrong. We've dug up many a skeleton in Asia, Africa, Europe, and the Americas. These skeletons date back to 14,000 BCE. Researchers have investigated whether these skeletons show evidence of traumatic injury. Did this person die violently? Based on these sorts of analyses, around 15% of our ancestors died violently. This is surely an underestimate because lots of people die violently in a way that leaves no trace on their skeleton. So at least 15% of our ancestors are dying violently. And that is a huge number.
How does it compare to our present numbers?
I'll tell you, less than 1% of people in the United States are murdered.
That's good.
Whereas for our hunter-gatherer ancestors, probably at least 1 out of 6 of them were murdered.
That's a really high number.
Our ancestors were not peaceful.
Evidently.
There's an analysis of contemporary or recent societies that make their living from hunting and gathering. These are tribes in the Americas, the Philippines, and Australia. The study found that about 14% of them are dying by warfare. So, in these tribes, which are a better approximation for how our ancestors lived, we see a lot of them are dying in war. 65 to 70% of hunter gatherer groups are at war at least every 2 years, and 90% engage in war at least once a generation.
I feel like there's so many wars going on right now, though.
That is true. That is true. War was more or less a constant throughout history. Peace was this brief interlude that happened in between wars. Wars were incredibly brutal, and we'll come back to the modern state of war versus peace. But just to give some context, historically, slavery and rape have been considered legitimate spoils of war. Whichever side loses a battle, all of the men are killed or enslaved or at least blinded. The women are raped and enslaved by the conquering party. In the Second Sino-Japanese War, Japanese troops captured Nanking, which was the capital of China at the time. Having taken the city, they proceeded to execute at least 100,000 people. Tens of thousands of women were raped, including children and the elderly. The Japanese burned people alive. The soldiers had beheading competitions to see who could kill the most people. The soldiers would throw a Chinese baby in the air and then catch it on their bayonet. Now, in fact, the world is much more peaceful than it used to be. There are still wars, and you hear about them. You hear about those wars a lot, but the frequency of wars between major powers has gone down substantially. So instead of the world being mostly at war at any given time, the world is now mostly peaceful.
That's encouraging, at least a little bit.
Here's a mystery. All right.
All right.
I'm going to ask you to be a detective.
Okay.
Analysis of human skeletons, some of them dating back 800,000 years, show evidence of human teeth marks. Some human bones show evidence of being cooked. Traces of human blood proteins have been found in cooking pots and ancient human poo. Do you know what this means?
Cannibalism.
Our ancestors were cannibals. There's no
I'm
doubt
glad we don't
about
do
it.
that.
What?
I'm glad we don't do that anymore.
Sure, yeah. Cannibalism was widespread. The Aztecs were cannibals. In some Mesoamerican cities, there were butcher shops which traded human flesh. The Iroquois Confederacy practiced cannibalism. We've been eating each other for a long time.
Seems like it.
And just going back to violence for 1 second, our hunter-gatherer ancestors were very violent. All right, how about more recent history? If we look at recent agricultural and industrialized societies, we see that they are much more violent than we are today. For example, in Western Europe, in the 1300s, the homicide rate was 50 times higher than what it is today.
Wow, that's a lot.
And the homicide rate has gone down pretty consistently over time. Torture was much more common in the past. Around the world, people were tortured as a punishment for breaking the law. Many of the infractions that warranted torture were nonviolent, like blasphemy, adultery, criticizing the government, unconventional sexual practices. Torture executions were also a popular form of entertainment.
That's not fun.
Throughout
It's like,
history, many millions of people have been tortured in hundreds of different ways. People have come up with torture devices which were designed to be as disturbing and gruesome as possible. I'm going to quote a passage from Steven Pinker's The Better Angels of Our Nature. Quote, "There is Judas's cradle used in the Spanish Inquisition. The naked victim was bound hand and foot, suspended by an iron belt around the waist, and lowered onto a sharp wedge that penetrated the anus or vagina. When victims relaxed their muscles, the point would stretch and tear their tissues. The Virgin of Nuremberg was a version of the Iron Maiden with spikes that were carefully positioned so as not to transfix the victim's vital organs and prematurely end his suffering. A series of engravings show victims hung by the ankles and sawn in half from the crotch down. The display explains that this method of execution was used all over Europe for crimes that included rebellion, witchcraft, and military disobedience. The pear is a split, spike-tipped wooden knob that was inserted into the mouth, anus, or vagina and spread apart by a screw mechanism to tear the victim open from the inside. It was used to punish sodomy, adultery, incest, heresy, blasphemy, and sexual union with Satan. The cat's paw, or Spanish tickler, was a cluster of hooks used to rip and shred a victim's flesh. Masks of infamy were shaped like the head of a pig or an ass. They subjected a victim both to public humiliation and to the pain of a blade or knob forced into their nose or mouth to prevent them from wailing. The heretic's fork had a pair of sharp spikes at each end. One end was propped under the victim's jaw, and the other at the base of his neck, so that as his muscles became exhausted, he would impale himself in both places. Unquote.
Thank you. That was horrifying. Absolutely atrocious.
I think it paints a picture.
It did.
It's a little more evocative than just hearing numbers, right?
Yes.
Today, torture is illegal in the Western world. In North American countries and Europe and Oceania, torture is not considered an ethical form of punishment. There was actually quite an uproar 20 years ago because the United States was using waterboarding in our effort to fight terrorism. The fact that people were upset by this shows how far we've come. People used to watch others get tortured in the most gruesome ways possible as a form of entertainment, and nowadays people are shocked and outraged when a Western country uses a comparatively mild form of torture.
Yeah. That's good, kind of, I guess. I don't know. I'm still shell shocked.
Torture is illegal in Japan and South Korea. Unfortunately, torture is still common in China, North Korea, and parts of the Middle East and North Africa. Human sacrifice was practiced around the world for thousands of years. It has been documented among the Germanic tribes, traditional Hawaiians, Scandinavians, Incas, Celts, various kingdoms in Western Africa. The Khans of Southeast India would purchase or capture children, live with them for a few months or a few years, and then sacrifice them by tying them to a pole, mutilating them, and dismembering them.
That's great. I
Yeah.
love that. Thank you.
Yeah. Well, I'm arguing that history was bad.
History.
This is part
You're
part of my
convincing me.
argument. Okay. Let's keep it rolling. Between 1440 and 1524 CE, the Aztecs were sacrificing something like 40 people a day,
Goodness.
more than 1 million people in total.
And
And as
1 million people to sacrifice is also impressive.
well, yeah, they would also like capture people to sacrifice them.
Okay, yeah. I was just thinking like that's a lot of people.
It is a lot of people. In an Aztec sacrifice, they would lower their victim into a fire, lift them out before they died, and then cut their beating heart out of their chest.
That's intense. That's kind of a really cool way to die. I would die by human sacrifice, maybe.
Sounds painful, though.
Yeah, but like they're gonna tear your beating heart out of your chest. It's kind of cool.
In India, sati was practiced for something like 1,500 years. If a woman's husband died, his body would be cremated and the woman was expected to join him on the funeral pyre, which is to say, if a woman's husband died, she had to burn herself to death. And uh because of religion and norms and stuff.
Okay. Culture. Got it.
And somewhere around 200,000 women died in this way.
Wow.
Human sacrifice is obviously much less common today. It does unfortunately continue to exist in parts of the world. In Uganda and Tanzania, there are reports of child sacrifice related to witchcraft. Drug cartels in Mexico have recently been engaging in human sacrifice because they think it will bring them good fortune. In Nigeria, human sacrifice is perpetrated by people who think that human body parts used in rituals can bring them wealth or power. But suffice it to say, people are much less willing to sacrifice one another in the name of religion or superstition than they were in the past.
Is the cartel just killing people because they think it's gonna like make them sell more drugs, or are they sacrificing them for religion? I'm so confused about that.
Yeah, it has something to do with it will make them more successful via some spiritual thing.
Interesting. That was kind of bewildering because it just doesn't make sense to me.
I mean, none of this makes sense.
No, but specifically the cartel. Like, you guys, we're beyond this.
The first evidence of slavery goes back 5,000 years or so, though slavery has probably been practiced since the dawn of agriculture around 10,000 years ago. Slavery has been practiced all around the world. The oldest human legal codes consist in large part of rules governing the treatment of slaves. The typical form of slavery practiced throughout history was chattel slavery, in which the slave was considered someone's personal property. Slaves could be bought and sold like livestock. Female slaves were often sex slaves. Treatment of slaves has varied quite a bit across time and place, but overall, it was a rather brutal institution. Slavery did not become brutal a few hundred years ago. It was always brutal. In ancient Rome, it was legal to torture slaves. Slaves were forced to engage in gladiatorial combat for entertainment. Slaves were forced to fight lions and tigers for the entertainment of an audience. Hundreds of millions of people have been enslaved throughout history. If we start from the beginning of recorded history and go up to the abolition of slavery, maybe 10 to 15% of the global population was enslaved.
That's kind of a lot.
It's kind of a lot. However, you want to divide humanity up into groups, it's fair to say that essentially all groups were enslaved and all groups did the enslaving. China practiced slavery for thousands of years, and Chinese slaves were sold to people in Thailand, Vietnam, and Malaysia. India practiced slavery for thousands of years, and Indians were enslaved by Arabs, Afghans, Portuguese, and other European powers. Slavery in Africa goes back to ancient Egypt. Africans have been enslaving Africans for thousands of years. Before European colonization, the Barbary pirates of North Africa enslaved more than 1 million Europeans. Africans were enslaved by peoples of the Middle East, the Americas, European powers, and peoples in Southeast Asia. Native American tribes were practicing slavery long before European contact. Post-European contact, some tribes did enslave Europeans and purchase African slaves. The Spanish and the Portuguese were the primary colonizers of Latin America and were responsible for enslaving a large number of native peoples. The Vikings of Scandinavia enslaved people of the British Isles, Ireland, and Eastern Europe. Indeed, the word slave itself is derived from Slav, the Slavic people of Eastern Europe, millions of whom were enslaved by Muslims and others. There's much more that could be said about the history of slavery, but the punchline is slavery is not some recent or local phenomenon. It is ubiquitous throughout history. There is no simple racist story that can be told about slavery. Indeed, it's not clear which human group was enslaved the most.
That's a lot of slavery. I guess I didn't realize that it went back that far and that many people.
Slavery is now outlawed in most countries and, of course, far less common than it used to be. However, it does still, unfortunately, continue to exist, particularly in Muslim and Black African countries. In Mauritania, a country in Northwest Africa, something like 20% of the population is enslaved. And across the world, there are currently somewhere around 50 million people who are enslaved.
There continues to be a lot of people that are enslaved. I understood that it was still something that was present. I didn't realize it was 50 million people, though.
Mm-hmm. Next, let's talk about babies and children.
Okay.
Infanticide has been practiced all around the world. An analysis of pre industrial societies found that 77% of them had an accepted custom of infanticide. Until pretty recently, between 10 and 15% of all babies born were killed shortly after birth. In some societies, the rate was as high as 50%. It's not unusual for cultures to preferentially kill female babies. Preferentially, female infanticide was practiced in China and India for more than 2,000 years. Chinese midwives would keep a bucket of water nearby so they could drown the baby if it was female. In India, they would poison, drown, or otherwise suffocate female infants. Infanticide is, of course, much less common than it used to be. In modern day United States, the infanticide rate is thousands of times lower than the historical average.
That's good.
Moving on to children. People have been beating kids for a long time.
Yes.
The expression, spare the rod and spoil the child, dates back to the 7th century BCE. It is attributed to an advisor of the king of Assyria. In medieval France, they would say, better to beat your child when small than to see him hang when grown.
I mean, don't beat your children, but that's kind of accurate.
I'm going to read a quote from the historian Lloyd de Maus. He's discussing violence towards children in medieval Europe. Quote, that children with devils in them had to be beaten goes without saying. A panoply of beating instruments existed for that purpose, from cat o' nine tails and whips to shovels, canes, iron rods, bundles of sticks. The discipline, a whip made of small chains. The goad, shaped like a cobbler's knife used to prick the child on the head or hands. And special school instruments like the flapper, which had a pear-shaped end and a round hole to raise blisters. The beatings described in the sources were almost always severe, involving bruising and bloodying the body, began in infancy, were usually erotically tinged by being inflicted on bare parts of the body near the genitals, and were a regular part of the child's daily life. Unquote.
Yeah, kids can't be hit anymore in schools either, which is also encouraging.
Mm-hmm.
Please don't hit children. But have you ever read A Modest Proposal?
No.
It has to do with infanticide. I'm forgetting who the author is, but the context is the country is in a major famine, and the leaders aren't doing anything about it. So he's proposing making it normative to kill and sell children up to 3, and cook and eat them
Mm-hmm.
because it would reduce the famine and people would have more money. And he says the way to solve it's satire, but he's saying it's the way to solve all of the country's problems.
I mean, it's modest.
We had to use it in high school to learn how to persuade in groups,
Mm-hmm.
like speaking. And I was on the kill baby side.
Okay.
We wanted, I think we won. We wanted to eat those babies. He was kind of accurate. I highly recommend
Okay.
reading it.
So corporal punishment has been practiced all around the world. One survey found that in the second half of the 18th century, every single American child had been beaten with a whip or a stick or some other weapon. The Aztecs would hold a child over a fire of dried peppers and make them inhale the smoke. Japanese children would be burned with incense. And I could go on like this for a while, but you get the point. Since the 1950s, the percentage of people who approve of spanking children has gone way down. In the 1930s, American parents spanked their children more than 30 times a year. By 1985, that number was down to around 7 times a year, and today it's even lower.
Today, a lot of people don't hit their kids. Just saying.
It's
It's a
true.
cool thing to
It's
do.
true. 67 countries have outlawed spanking. In general, wealthier countries tend to spank their children less. Child abuse, which we are conceptualizing as being different from spanking. Child abuse has gone way down since 1990. Both physical abuse and sexual abuse are much less common. School bullying has decreased. Since the 90s, the percentage of students reporting getting into fights in school has gone down, and the percentage of students who say they are afraid at school has gone down.
That's encouraging.
Indeed, indeed. Next, we'll talk about a bunch of different historical trends. There are many ways that the world has gotten better slash less violent. Over the last 200 years, there's been a huge increase in the proportion of countries that are democratic rather than autocratic. Many countries that used to be dictatorships and or socialist totalitarian states are now democracies. Cars are safer. Since 1920, your chance of dying in a car crash has gone down 92%.
That's a
Plane,
lot.
that's a lot. Planes are safer. We are 96% less likely to die in a plane crash compared to the 1970s.
Nice.
Over the past 100 years, people have become less likely to die in a fire or by drowning. People are less likely to die in a natural disaster, in part due to the fact that we're better at predicting natural disasters and we're better at responding to them. In 1870, the average work week was more than 60 hours. Now the average is less than 40. And of course, we are much, much richer compared to 1870. So we spend less time working and we are much richer.
Yes, that's a good thing.
In the United States, since 1965, the amount of leisure time that people have has gone up quite a bit. It used to be that pretty much all countries practiced the death penalty. Now, more than 100 countries have abolished the death penalty.
We still practice the death
We
penalty.
still got it,
Yeah,
but there's a trend.
there is.
The world suicide rate has gone down more than 30% since 1990.
Good.
In the past, around the world, it was common for homosexual behavior to be illegal. In 1790, the number of countries that had decriminalized homosexuality was around zero. And nowadays, 133 countries have decriminalized it. Indeed, gay marriage is now legal in 35 countries.
So not only decriminalized, but also legal.
Not only decriminalized, but you can get married and the state will recognize the marriage.
Yay.
Racism has gone way down. In 1950, around 43% of countries had policies that discriminated against ethnic minorities. Nowadays, that number is below 20%. Indeed, nowadays, there are more countries that have policies that favor ethnic minorities than policies that discriminate against ethnic minorities.
Nice.
In 1942, around 2 out of 3 white Americans said that black and white students should go to separate schools. By 1997, that number was around 5%. In the 60s, more than 40% of white people said that they would move if a black family moved in next door. Once you get to the mid 90s, that number's around 5%. In the late 1950s, 95% of Americans were opposed to interracial marriage. Today, 95% of Americans approve of interracial marriage.
Those are all really encouraging numbers.
Tana, around how many unarmed black people do the police kill each year in the United States?
I'm going to say 100.
The average from 2015 to 2022 was 23.
Okay.
So 23. This is quite a bit lower than the estimate most people give. Now, of course, most people haven't looked into these statistics. They're just kind of going based on the vibes that they see on social media and such. Actually, on average, in a given year, more unarmed white people are killed by the police than unarmed black people. Now, that is, of course, what you would expect since there's more white people than black people in the United States. Since 2013, the rate of fatal police shootings hasn't changed much. If anything, they've gone down slightly.
Good.
Since 1973, rape has gone down by about 80% in the United States. Indeed, well into the 1970s, marital rape was not a crime in any state.
Is it now?
It is now. Since the 90s, domestic violence has gone way down. The rate of reported violence against women by their intimate partners has fallen by almost 2/3. The rate against men has fallen by almost half.
That's good.
Since 1976, there's been a significant decrease in homicide of intimate partners in the United States. Now, turning to animals. In many ways, the treatment of animals has improved over time. Animals that are going to be used in scientific research now have more protections than they did in the past. Commercial labs that utilize animal testing now do so less than they would have in the past, and that testing is more highly regulated. Indeed, firms will advertise the fact that their products are cruelty-free.
Yes, many brands do that.
Mhm. Blood sports have been outlawed in many countries. In the United States, for example, dogfighting and cockfighting are illegal. So people seem to care more about the welfare of animals than they used to.
Mm-hmm. For sure.
There is a countervailing trend which must be mentioned. That is that people don't seem to care very much about the welfare of the animals that they eat, especially if they're not going to have to see the animals suffer.
Right.
Economic growth has led to more people eating more meat. In fact, we raised twice as many animals for food as we did in the late 1980s. Livestock farmers, of course, want to make as much money as possible, which means spending as little money as possible taking care of their livestock. So, due to economic forces, the animals that we eat have pretty terrible living conditions. Hens are kept in small battery cages where they could barely move around. Chickens have the tips of their beaks cut off to prevent them from pecking each other, and this is usually done without anesthesia. Piglets have their tails cut off to prevent them from biting each other's tails, again without anesthesia. Animals are often selectively bred or genetically manipulated to grow rapidly or produce more milk, eggs, or meat than they would naturally. This leads to chronic health conditions. For example, broiler chickens are bred to grow so quickly that their legs often cannot support their own body weight.
My goodness.
In the United States, basically all the meat that we consume comes from these factory farms where animals seem to have a pretty poor quality of life. The world getting richer results in more people eating more meat because people like meat, which results in more animals being bred in these terrible conditions.
Mm-hmm.
More than 100 billion animals are killed for meat and other animal products each year. So we're killing more than 250 million animals per day.
Per day is
Per day.
crazy. Wow.
So if you do the utilitarian math on this, it ends up looking pretty bad.
Yeah.
There are so many animals that are factory farmed that it seems plausible that animal welfare has gone down on net over time.
Right.
So overall, it seems like people do care about animal welfare more than they used to. But if it's an animal bred to be consumed and we don't have to actually see the way that they're being treated, we don't care too much about it.
This is why I started following lots of livestock pages on Instagram because they sell their livestock as meat once it's grown, but
Mm-hmm.
it lives a happy life. It
Mm-hmm.
doesn't live in a factory farm. I just think it's important to know that there's alternatives.
Yeah.
Like if you want to find sustainably sourced meat, you can find it. It might have barriers like cost and location, though, is the unfortunate thing.
And there's developments in lab grown meat. There's some kind of rebranding of that. I don't know what they're calling it these days, but
I think I've
because
seen
lab
that.
grown weirds people out. So,
Beyond, is that the Beyond
well,
meat?
that's plant based.
Okay.
The lab grown meat would be, it's literally meat cells.
So, like, technically, it's meat,
It is meat, but there was
just
just
not.
never a conscious animal that you got the meat from.
That's, I don't know. That weirds me out too, but like, it's a good thing.
Yeah, we'll save that debate for another episode.
All right.
But there we have it. Atana, I rest my case. History was bad.
History was bad.
The past was bad.
Yeah.
And things have gotten better.
Okay. Yes, things have gotten better. It's just that things are still like kind of not great. They're a lot better.
Right. To say that they're better is not to say that every single trend you can possibly look at is good.
Right.
It's not like every year is better than the previous year in every possible way. But the story of history is clearly a story of improvement.
Yes. Over lots and lots and lots of time.
Mm-hmm. All right, now let's put on our scientist cap.
Okay.
What the heck is going on here? Why have things gotten better?
I want to say like humans got better at social management or something.
And what does social management mean?
Like allocation of resources and dispersion of jobs and working together to create things to meet our needs. Yes, maybe. And government too.
Yeah, so better government, like maybe democracy, something could be a
Yeah.
factor.
Yeah, kind of.
And then you kind of gestured at wealth, economic growth.
Yeah.
As we've discussed in previous episodes, our economic growth is largely due to scientific advances, innovations, free markets. There have been surveys that investigate the values and political attitudes of people around the world. People are asked about race and homosexuality and gender and abortion and lots of other questions. You, of course, find that people in different parts of the world tend to have different values. One of the major predictors of these values is wealth. People in rich countries have different values than people in poorer countries. To the extent that this relationship is causal, it serves as evidence that the changing wealth throughout time could also have had a causal effect on people's values.
Yeah, that makes sense.
And it's not difficult to come up with causal theories to explain why wealth might lead to lots of things getting better. If
Right.
you're starving and you think that violence could result in you getting food, you might be rather inclined to use violence. Whereas if you're rich and comfortable, violence is not going to seem so attractive.
Yeah, that makes sense.
If you have advanced technology, slaves are much less useful. There would be very few economically viable uses of slavery in modern Western economies. It would be more efficient to just hire people and pay them in the typical way.
It would be more efficient.
It'd be more efficient to just hire them.
Yes.
Infanticide is often driven by economic concerns. It is more likely to be committed by poor people who do not have the means to raise the child. And there are other stories you can tell about the positive societal effects of wealth. Suffice it to say, society getting wealthier is generally good in lots of ways.
Yeah, evidently.
Another factor, and this is related to the increase in wealth, is that the capacity for trade makes other people more valuable to you. Trade makes everyone better off, whereas war makes everyone worse off, especially the losers. If you can trade with other groups, then they become more valuable to you alive than dead.
Right.
It becomes cheaper to buy things than to steal them.
Yes.
Our capacity for trade increased over time as technology allowed for transportation over longer distances among larger groups of people at a lower cost.
So because of trade, we got wealthier and got a lot of improvements in society.
Trade made us wealthier, and also this availability of trade was a disincentive for violence.
Yeah.
Because if it used to be like, well, we'll go over here, kill these people, take their stuff, but they might come over here and take our stuff and kill us. If we could
Right.
trade with them, that's better for everyone.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
Another factor is the state monopoly on violence. There is a government. The government gets to use violence in a narrowly prescribed way, and you do not. So the government can use violence to enforce laws, but your everyday citizen cannot use violence outside of emergency scenarios. This is very important because if there is no state monopoly on violence, you're going to have to use violence to protect yourself and your property. Say somebody steals your livestock, you're going to have to retaliate. If you don't, people will know that they can steal from you and face no consequences. And this leads to cycles of vendetta, where one group harms another group, and then there's a retaliation, and then there's a retaliation to the retaliation, and so on. This is a reason why criminal organizations like the mafia are so violent. They can't rely on the state. Also, the absence of a state monopoly on violence can incentivize a first strike. If you are afraid that your neighbor Bob is going to kill you and take your stuff, and Bob is afraid you're going to kill him and take his stuff, you both may reason you're better off killing your neighbor before they kill you.
And then nobody wins.
Right. Another factor that accounts for this improvement that we see throughout history is the power of ideas. People change their minds in response to arguments. Throughout time, people have come up with new ideas, and these ideas have been able to spread due to increases in literacy and innovations like the printing press. For example, if somebody thinks homosexuality is wrong, one possible causal reason could be their religion. Perhaps their religion explicitly says that homosexuality is wrong. This person might come across arguments against the existence of God or arguments against the validity of their particular religion. If, due to these arguments, they come to believe that their religion is not accurate, that change in belief could ripple out to their moral beliefs, including their view of homosexuality. So, being exposed to new arguments can lead people to change their minds on issues that affect the welfare of lots of people.
Yeah, absolutely. I say a lot of the time that people just don't know what they don't know. And it's life changing when they learn it.
That's the point of this podcast. We're here to change lives, Atana.
We're here to learn you what you don't learn.
During the Enlightenment, a bunch of smart dudes made explicit arguments in favor of human rights, the rule of law, the separation of church and state, and a bunch of other liberal ideas.
Thanks, dudes.
It is widely thought that these Enlightenment ideas played a causal role in shaping Western society.
Thanks, dudes. Super helpful.
And a final factor that perhaps played a role in the improvement that we see throughout history is empathy. Our human capacity to care about others can be stretched. By default, humans care about themselves, they care about their genetic relatives. This circle of care can be stretched to include fellow tribe members. It can be stretched to include cute, fluffy animals. It can be stretched to include all conscious animals, even if they are not so cute and fluffy. And nowadays, people are having debates about what sorts of artificial intelligence systems are worth caring about and deserving of personhood. The expansion of our circle of care seems to be driven in part by empathy. We can learn that other people are really quite similar to ourselves, that if you cut them, they bleed, they suffer as we suffer. We can learn about other people through travel and journalism. We get to experience the inner lives of other people through literature and drama. The abolition of slavery in the United States is in part attributed to novels like Uncle Tom's Cabin, which allowed readers to empathize with what it's like to be a slave. And once people empathized with slaves, slaves became part of the circle of care, and it no longer seemed ethical to keep them enslaved. Empathic experiences seem to expand our circle of care. As humanity got richer, these empathic experiences were enabled by innovations in transportation and media. Well, that's pretty much all I have to say about history.
There's always more to learn.
Well, not from me. That's all I have to say. Do you have any other thoughts about history?
I do not. But this was an interesting episode.
Tana, did you know this podcast has been going on for a year now?
That's crazy to me. Doesn't
Yeah.
feel like it. Happy 1 year anniversary of our podcast.
Happy 1 year anniversary. The first episodes of this podcast were about philosophy. We talked about free will and consciousness and God and why the universe exists in the first place. Then we did more than 20 episodes, which were mostly focused on science. Having done that, we are now ready to turn back to philosophy, to address questions we weren't quite ready to address when the podcast began.
Okay.
Like, what is truth? Is there an objective reality? Is morality objective? Atana, if somebody says abortion is morally wrong, can their view be described as factually correct or factually incorrect? Or is it just an opinion? We will discuss these questions and more on the next episode of The Scientific Worldview.